Hi guys! In this lesson, we're going to be learning about the nitrogen cycle. Again, like I said in the last video, it is best practice to take notes, especially during this video, because there's a lot of vocabulary and it can get kind of confusing. So the more notes you take, the better you're going to understand this topic. So let's begin. The first thing we're going to talk about is what is nitrogen. Nitrogen is an element found on the periodic table, and it makes up about 78% of our atmosphere. Nitrogen in the atmosphere is mostly found in the form of N2, which we sometimes just call atmospheric nitrogen. This is a compound that plants and animals actually cannot use. So we have to convert this atmospheric nitrogen into compounds that can be used by plants and animals. This process is called the nitrogen cycle. Now, why do we care about nitrogen? We care about nitrogen because nitrogen is an element that all living organisms have to have. It's an essential component of DNA, RNA, and proteins, which are our building blocks of life. Remember that when we learned about DNA, we learned about something called nitrogenous bases. These bases, your A's and T's and C's and G's, those are the bases that hold together your two strands of DNA. You can't have DNA without nitrogen, so if there's no nitrogen, there's not going to be any living things. The main question we're going to be answering today is how does this atmospheric nitrogen get changed into a form that can be used by living organisms? The way that this occurs is by traveling through one of 4 different processes in the nitrogen cycle. These processes are nitrogen fixation, ammonification, nitrification, and denitrification. During this lesson, we're going to be going over each of these 4 processes. At this point, I also want to mention that because this is a cycle, all of these processes rely on one another for the cycle to work properly. If you skip or you take out steps in a cycle, the cycle won't work the way that it's supposed to. So let's begin with process number 1, nitrogen fixation. Nitrogen fixation is the process in which the atmospheric nitrogen breaks and combines with other compounds. The nitrogen is what we call fixed when it combines with either hydrogen or oxygen. If the nitrogen combines with hydrogen, it forms something called ammonia. Ammonia is used in a lot of things, specifically cleaning solutions and fertilizers. You might be familiar with those. If the nitrogen is combined with oxygen, it forms something called nitrous oxide. Again, you might be familiar with this, especially if you've ever been to the dentist. If you've been to the dentist and had to ever get laughing gas, that is nitrous oxide. It's also used a lot in rockets and car engines. Most of the time, people just call it nitrous. And a lot of people use that to help them when they're racing their cars because it gives you more engine power. So if you're into cars, you might know what nitrous is. Now, there are 3 different ways that we can fix nitrogen. The first way is through a special bacteria that can convert nitrogen gas to ammonia. This only occurs in some plants like peas and beans. Those are called legumes. And so this process of fixing nitrogen doesn't help all the plants on Earth. The second way is through lightning. When lightning strikes, it converts that atmospheric nitrogen into nitrates or nitrous oxide, which are forms that plants and animals can use. The third way is through industrial production. There are chemical plants and factories that manipulate your atmospheric nitrogen into the form of ammonia. Most of the time, this is talking about making fertilizer. Fertilizer is something that you put on your plants to help them grow. Remember that plants need nitrogen to survive, and they don't always get it from the soil naturally. So gardeners and farmers will use fertilizer to help these plants get the nitrogen that they need so that they can grow bigger and faster. Now let's talk specifically about this first way of fixing nitrogen. In plants like beans and peanuts, which are called legumes, there is a bacteria that's found in the roots, and that bacteria is able to turn atmospheric nitrogen into a form of nitrogen that these plants are able to use. The bacteria lives on the roots and helps them constantly get nitrogen from the atmosphere into this new form. These types of plants don't have to have a nitrogen-containing fertilizer because they already have a really good source of nitrogen. Now, thinking back to the last couple weeks, we just learned about something called ecological relationships. This bacteria and plant have a symbiotic relationship. In this situation, the bacteria and the plant are both getting something good. So this would be an example of mutualism. The bacteria transforms nitrogen into a form that the plant can use. So the plant is benefiting by getting nitrogen. And then the plant provides an environment for the bacteria to live. So the bacteria is getting safety and shelter. Both of these things are positive, so this would be considered mutualism. The second process in the nitrogen cycle is called ammonification. After all the living organisms have used up the organic nitrogen that's found in plants, decomposer bacteria converts that nitrogen to ammonia. So when you have plants that die, or animals that die, or animals that have produced waste, like poop, you will have bacteria that grows in that area and converts that nitrogen back into ammonia and puts it in the soil so that other plants are able to use it. Remember that this is what legumes like beans and peas use. So when we turn things back into ammonia, we're turning it into that so that legumes can use it. The third process is called nitrification. This is the process that converts that ammonia that's now in the soil to nitrates or nitrites, which are the form that most of the plants on Earth are able to use. It's also important to note that ammonia comes from both nitrogen fixation and ammonification. Process number 1 that we talked about and process number 2 that we talked about. Both of these processes use bacteria to help us make this ammonia. So bacteria plays a very large role in the nitrogen cycle. Bacteria makes the ammonia, and then through this nitrification process, we turn that ammonia into something that all plants are able to use. The last process in the nitrogen cycle is called denitrification. This is the process in which nitrogen compounds convert back into the atmospheric nitrogen. So we're putting nitrogen back up into the air. This process can be done in a couple of ways. The first is through, again, bacteria in the soil. The second way that you can perform this process is by burning fossil fuels. In the last video, we talked about the fact that when you burn oil or coal or other fossil fuels, you're emitting carbon into the atmosphere. But at the same time, you're also going to be emitting nitrogen into the atmosphere. Remember that in the last video, I discussed global warming, or the greenhouse effect. One of the greenhouse gases that affect the temperature of our Earth is nitrous oxide, a compound that has nitrogen in it. So let's review what we've discussed. For nitrogen to be used by different organisms on Earth, it has to get changed into different compounds, and the way that we do that is through this nitrogen cycle. The first step to that nitrogen cycle is nitrogen fixation. And that's whenever either bacteria changes nitrogen into ammonia for plants, or lightning changes it into nitrates, which all plants are able to use. The second step is ammonification, which is part of the decaying process. When a plant or animal dies, decomposers like bacteria turn that nitrogen back into ammonia so that it can re-enter the nitrogen cycle through the soil. Once we have ammonia in the soil, it is going to get converted into nitrates and nitrites through nitrification. That way, all plants on Earth can use the nitrogen. And then last but not least, when you have extra nitrogen in the soil, it'll get put back into the air through denitrification. Now, the most important part of this nitrogen cycle is honestly bacteria. Bacteria helps us do every single one of these 4 steps. The last thing we're going to talk about in this video is the human impact on the nitrogen cycle. There are a couple of things that we as humans do that can throw the nitrogen cycle off balance. The first of these is combustion. Combustion is the process of burning things. So anytime you're burning, you're releasing toxic nitrogen compounds into the atmosphere. The more things that humans have burning, the more of that toxic nitrogen compound is going to be in our air. The second way that humans affect the nitrogen cycle is through commercial fertilizers. Remember that all the way back at step 1 of the nitrogen cycle, nitrogen fixation, One of the ways we were able to fix nitrogen was through making fertilizer in factories. These commercial fertilizers release nitrous oxide into our atmosphere, which is a greenhouse gas, and introduce an excess amount of nitrogen into our environment. Commercial fertilizers are the #1 contributor of new nitrogen into the nitrogen cycle. Farmers and gardeners use commercial fertilizer because nitrogen is something that all plants have to have for growth. But the problem is, it's hard to apply fertilizer and keep it in just that one little area. When it rains or when you water your plants, a lot of the times the fertilizer will run off into different areas. So farmers normally apply twice as much as they actually need to make sure that their plants get all of the nitrogen possible. This extra nitrogen can end up disrupting your local food chains. Another way that humans can impact the nitrogen cycle is through mining. When we mine for mineral deposits, a lot of the times we're removing nitrogen from the soil because those minerals have a lot of nitrogen in them. Lastly, humans impact the nitrogen cycle by the discharge of sewage. The sewage releases excess nitrogen into water ecosystems, and this disrupts your aquatic balance and can end up killing fish. Now, these are some checkpoint questions for you. I want you to pause this video and make sure that you can answer all 6 of these questions. If you can't answer all 6 of these questions, rewind the video and rewatch until you can answer the questions. All right, you guys have a great rest of your day.